we've abandoned the Monroe Doctrine, and we've allowed, Russia, we've allowed China, we've allowed the IRGC and Iranians to penetrate into Latin America. Latin America is part of the Americas. You can't cede Latin America, if you're in charge here in the United States. No, I think there's been great dereliction close to home in the post-Cold War period.
Let me ask you this. Do you feel that our country is safer now than when it was in 2020? Do you feel any safer? Do you feel better under the Biden administration, or did you feel a lot safer and a lot more secure under the Trump administration? Ask yourself that. Has the Biden administration made our enemies weaker, or has the Biden administration's policies made our enemies stronger? Look at what just happened in Israel. Look at what's happening in Iraq. Look at what's happening all across the globe. I mean, I personally think the Biden administration has emboldened our enemies. China is rapidly expanding its Navy and doing joint missions with Russia in the Arctic. And Iran is also backing Hezbollah and Hamas. Russia is continuing its attack on Ukraine, and it's not planning on stopping anytime soon. And Biden's weakness in Afghanistan was just one sign of many that told Al-Qaeda, Islamic State, Taliban, and every other terrorist organization, as well as maniacal leaders, that we are weak and that the world is open for their business. And they are holding us hostage in many, many ways. I don't think any of this would have happened if President Trump would have been in office. I certainly don't believe Hamas would have even attempted through Iran to attack Israel. I certainly don't think China would be moving in our hemisphere the way it is right now, and its Belt and Road Initiative targeting us with these proxy attacks, like using fentanyl and taking away our strategic placement in the Western Hemisphere if President Trump was in office. And I certainly do not believe that Vladimir Putin would make the move that he made, because he didn't when President Trump was in office. He did under Obama with Georgia. But when President Trump was in office, he didn't make any moves. It wouldn't have happened. I have a decorated veteran, author, and national security expert on the show today that's going to break this all down for us. You do not want to miss this show. He is an expert. He's going to lay it all out, and you are going to get a full understanding of what the threat really is. And he's also an author of a phenomenal book, The Ghosts of Samara. But before we get to him, I want to talk to you about Goldco, guys. I love Goldco. Why? Because it will help us protect our investments. This administration wants you taxed to the brink, under the thumb of the IRS, and controlled with the digital dollar. That's why thousands of hardworking, patriotic Americans, including myself, are turning to Goldco. Our current offer right now is huge. Free 2024 gold kit, and you can learn how to possibly get $10,000 in bonus silver as a listener of this show. You can't beat that. They've helped people like you and me place over $3.5 billion in gold and silver. Protect your family's financial future and your freedom. Get started today at SaraLikesGold.com. That's SARA likesgold.com. That's SaraLikesGold.com. Get your free gold kit from Goldco and learn how to get $10,000 in bonus silver. SaraLikesGold.com. SaraLikesGold.com. That's SaraLikesGold.com. I want to thank Dr. Tobias Vogt for being on the Sarah Carter Show today. Thank you, Dr. Vogt, for joining me today.
Thanks very much for having me, Sarah.
Well, you are the former chief of advanced civil schooling for the U.S. Army, and you served in several senior joint interagency positions within the U.S. government prior to retirement. You're also the author of the book, Ghosts of Samara, and this story is one that I don't think a lot of people are familiar with. It's interesting, unless you served in the military, a lot of the real true grit of what happened in Iraq disappeared. from the media, from the mainstream media. It was like, unless you sought it out or you knew people who were involved in the battles or in the battlefield, you really wouldn't know what our men and women in uniform actually went through and what it took to resolve some of those conflicts in the region. Talk a little bit about the ghosts of Samara before we go into what I think is going to be your expertise on what is happening there now, particularly with Iran and Iranian aggression in the region against U.S. forces.
Thanks, Sarah. That's a great lead in. The news cycle is very short. So
right.
Once Iraq and Afghanistan went out of vogue, it was really hard to get information, especially for family members that were back in the rear, wondering what was going on at any given time. Now, my focus on Ghosts of Samara was because I was in that battalion for Operation Iraqi Freedom 1 and Operation Iraqi Freedom 2. I modeled the book on an earlier book that I wrote. It was on my grandfather's division in World War II, and it was called Iron Men and Mets. If you look at both of those books, they're not the books of the general. It's not famous Eisenhower. It's not any of the generals that led campaigns in Afghanistan or Iraq. It's the soldier stories is what I tried to capture. So in Ghosts of Samara, I write an outline. So if you'd never heard of the Second Gulf War, you could pick that book up and look at ancient history of Iraq. Not too much of it. I mean, I made sure just to highlight it a little bit. But you can look at ancient history of Iraq and how we got to where we were in 2003 and 2004 when the book unfolds. So it really focuses on 8 soldiers that were there at the company level and below, and it tells their story. And they have interesting stories to tell. None of them are the same. Some are long-winded. One, Matt Debkowski that's in there, his story goes on and on for almost 60 pages. Others, had less to say, but they were much more colorful than he was. But Ghosts of Samara focuses on 2003, 2004 in Iraq.
I was thinking about that when you talk about the stories and thinking about my husband, thinking about the men who served with him out on the battlefield and their stories. They may not think their stories resonate with people outside of the military, but they do. They are these amazing stories of heroism and sometimes deep sadness or lessons learned, that I think are so important to pay attention to, especially in a time where I feel like even our lawmakers have failed on our military and have failed on understanding what the root causes of, a bad cycle of military warfare can bring if you're not paying attention to history, right? If you're not listening to the men on the battlefield. My whole thing when I covered the war, it was about bringing their stories, not trying to tell the story I wanted, but telling the stories of the men and women who were in the war zones, whether that be somebody who was a nurse or working a particular job at Bagram Airfield, or the guys in the striker units, which is what who these are the men that you're covering, the men in the striker brigades, that were out there putting their lives really literally on the line every day, never knowing if they were going to roll over an IED, never knowing if somebody was going to strike them. Tell me a little bit about what that did and why you decided, because I think this is important, why you decided to tell their stories versus trying to pontificate. You know what I mean? You're telling the story and letting it speak for itself, I guess.
Well, I've always been interested in the soldier's story, even from when I was a young man. I put a picture on my website. I have a website, myretirement.com, and it shows a 4-year-old me wearing my grandfather's helmet that has a hole in it where he was shot in the head, and it just grazed around his skull and some of his web gear that he brought back. But I was always fascinated by, especially the World War II and the Vietnam era stories, and to a lesser extent, Korea. And that's only because we didn't have very many Korea vets, but I loved their stories. And I joined the military early and stayed in for the next 3 decades of my life. And I still loved to hear the soldier stories, even as I got higher and higher in rank. For anybody that's been around the military, you know that you might start at the lower levels, but rapidly you progress higher and higher and higher. And some people can lose touch, with those young soldiers that are coming in. But I love to hear the young soldiers, young non-commissioned officers, young officers' stories and how they perceive things, because no two perceive them the same way. They might talk the same because they're in the barracks or wherever together, but they all have personal experiences that they brought in before, and they mesh that with what they've seen and observed and experienced. And I find that fascinating. So I've really always been drawn to that, Sarah. It's not something that I developed as I went through a graduate school program after graduate school program. It's where my focus was early on in life.
Let me ask you this. I mean, as a senior military official and somebody who's served in multiple capacities in the military, do you feel that our troops are listened to? Do you feel that people, as you get higher up, pay attention to the men and women who are on the ground? I mean, I know, their perception of the war is directly being affected by what they are seeing on the ground. And a lot of times that intelligence to me that they're collecting just by being in a village or spending a lot of time in a combat outpost, those things actually, I think, are so beneficial to strategy at the higher levels. And sometimes I think that's the disconnect. Like I would talk to people at ISAF or, I remember going with Admiral Mullen one time on a trip to Kosovo. And, and I remember saying to him, we're looking at these archives, but are we really paying attention to what senior, either U.S. Forces on the ground are seeing and saying, as well as those from our Afghan allies? I feel like there's this big disconnect on how we're handling, the war fighting.
I don't think that's new either, Sarah.
Right.
Years ago, I mean, I was a young Green Beret, and we would go down to Latin America, and then they'd want us to train forces in Latin America, and they would say, okay, use the American template and train them up to a standard comparable to ours. Then we get down there on the ground, and we'd realize that, wow, a lot of the soldiers are illiterate. A lot of soldiers have just been conscripted off the street. You put them on the rifle range, and malnutrition means that they have poor eyesight at a very young age.
Right.
And there are just so many barriers to taking the higher level template and implementing it on the ground. So I don't think that's new with the wars in Afghanistan or Iraq or what's going on today.
That brings me to Iraq right now. We're seeing Iran encroaching in Iraq. I mean, I think our men and women fought valiantly in Iraq. I think they fought valiantly in Afghanistan. And I was there to witness that myself, the best of the best, just like my husband said, not just World War II. They were great men and women, but we had great men and women on the battlefield in the Middle East, and many who sacrificed their lives and their limbs. But right now we see Iran expanding in their influence of power in the Middle East. We see Iran right now even trying to encroach in the Antarctic. I just read a story on that to this morning. That's just unbelievable to me. Again, and we're watching other adversaries vying for power. Vladimir Putin in Ukraine, China, encroaching on economic fronts, as well as I would say in our Western hemisphere with proxy wars like the use of fentanyl. When you look at what's happening right now and how our adversaries are strategically operating against, I believe, our Western influence that we've had for decades, as a power center on the globe, what is going through your mind as a military leader? Like, oh, wow, wait a minute. Are we looking at a potential, serious problem? I mean, could this blow up into multiple war fronts? I mean, is that going through your mind?
Not so much that. So much that we're behind, and we don't need to be behind from where we stand, our position in the world. I always, in class, I would tell the students about Eisenhower and pointing out on his way out, beware of that military industrial complex, number one. But number two, it's not just about military, it's about economic as well. That two-pronged approach, military and economic. So when you look at the three problems that you described there, they're all connected in some way. But if you look at China and you look at Russia, historically, they're regional powers that they're flexing their muscle regionally. Now, China, with its Belt and Road Initiative and other things, has reached out globally, but largely they're old great powers that want to remain relevant in their regions. Iran is where I get on my soapbox talking about Iran, and the number one exporter of terror, and not just the militant, but also the business interest of. And when we say Iran, I'll say of the IRGC throughout the world, as they're propping up, paying for, and training and equipping some of the most violent proxy fighters in the world. And you see that at this point, whether it's Hamas, Hezbollah, whether it's encroaching well beyond the Middle East, using all the financial benefit that they've received from the Obama and the Biden administrations. That's disheartening. It's disheartening, and it points to no strategic objective for the United States in the Middle East.
And that, to me, is a very, very telling statement. When you say that, it almost as if U.S. foreign policy in the Middle East under this administration right now is, I feel in a sense, has robbed the achievements that we have made in that region of the world. And particularly when we see what Iran is doing now. And I did pull up the article just as, we were getting ready to do this podcast. This came across my desk, but Iran claims Antarctica. U.S. State Department responds to that state safety challenge. So it's just it's ridiculous. I mean, they're trying to claim that they have Antarctica, but then we're just kind of like, once again, we're throwing our hands up in the air. Like, how are we going to handle this, on an international level when we've held out the olive branch to the Ayatollahs, and to the IRGC, like you said, because Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps is the one that's benefiting from this too. We saw what happened in Israel. That wasn't just Hamas operating alone. It was certainly a tactic used by Iran.
Absolutely. And out of the three adversaries that you talked about, China, Russia, and Iran, Iran, we can deal with. We can deal with Iran if we just put our heads together, develop a decent foreign policy with a clear strategic objective in the region, and tell them we're not going to put up with it.
Right.
It's been done. Look at the Trump administration. We're not going to put up with it.
Absolutely. Why aren't they doing that, though? Why did the Obama administration and I call it the Obama-esque administration under Biden, why are they so apt at appeasing this cult-like regime that even its own people, young men and women in Iran, have stood up and said no more, willing to sacrifice their lives to stand up to this regime? Why is it that people within our government want to appease it? Is it they're just set on this JCPOA and they think that somehow that cutting a nuke deal is going to make Iran safer? I mean, I can't believe that. I just can't believe that's the reason.
I can't speak for the Obama or the Biden administration. I think they have terrible policies. Whether you want to talk about how much they contributed to the Arab Spring, whether you want to talk about how much they contributed in financial benefit to Iran, they have terrible policies concerning the Middle East and the rest of the world. But they follow that globalist mindset, the globalist mindset that was really pushed. First, it was democratization, then it was globalization after the Cold War. That they were just pushed nonstop. But at this point, someone in that camp needs to realize that that's a failed approach to failed policies in the Middle East. They need to reassess. And I always say that it's hard for the United States to have really any sort of sustainable strategic objectives because we have all the schizophrenic power changes every 2 to 4 years, and
Yes.
especially 8. Historically, will completely change course at some point in any policy that we put out there. So it's very difficult. I mean, you can come in like President Trump did, try to clean up 8 years of previous bad policy, but only to leave office and have the very same actors that were there waiting in the think tanks that lean towards the Democrat side, waiting to come back into government and re-implement the same or similar policies. But that's American history. That's our system, and it's difficult to stay the course.
It is. We got to keep, at least if we think a policy is working as Americans, our duty is to go vote and ensure that that policy continues. And that's what we have in a republic. And it makes it frustrating for those of us who actually watch great policies crumble and world, I guess, stability threatened when those policies aren't enforced. You said something very important. And you said we could fix Iran if we wanted to. The other two, not so much. Not so much. I've very been hyper focused on China for a while. I've been watching, especially China's expansion, probably not to the extent you are familiar with it, but China's expansion in the Western Hemisphere, its interest in the Belt and Road Initiative, what's happening in the United States as far as like land grabs near our most strategic military installations from here in Texas, where I'm at near Laughlin Air Base, to the Dakotas, to Montana, to the balloon flying overhead, to the implementation of, I could go on and on and on, but under Obama, when they put their Huawei 5G systems in our Verizon towers to nowhere, I stood on those towers right near the silos, right in the area on the silos, exactly, right in the area of those towers in Montana. We have 150 ICBM silos out there. What is going on here? I mean, look, China is reassessing its position in the world, right?
Oh, that's been ongoing for decades now, Sarah. So whether you talk about, the intelligence and the catch-up game in their technology, whether you talk about, the tentacles of their global economic system, they have been strategic for decades in what they're trying to do, rising to that mantle of the number one global power. I think we're years and years and years away from that, but they are much more united than whether it's Russia or whether it's the United States in their goals. I like to show people their scoring system for their social scoring system and their surveillance state in some of their major cities to say that, hey, China is united at the leadership level. And they're going to work towards their goals. You can look at some of the environmental policies. I was watching the news last week, and they talked about the solar panel makers in Europe within 6 months of bankruptcy. But then they put up the slide that says, well, 97% of solar panels in Europe are currently Chinese made. Only 3% are European made. Right. You can jump from there to electric vehicles and some of the new technologies that are coming online that China has positioned itself well. America has lost smelting capabilities. So when your electric vehicle battery pack is no longer good and you have to swap it out at the cost of a brand new car, where do we send those batteries to be smelted? Do we ship them to China to be smelted? So China is well positioned. Russia's an aging.
What about Taiwan? How do you see Taiwan and China right now? I mean, do you see Taiwan just move inside, just like, whoa, any minute now, just any minute now?
So
China will come in.
Maybe not. China can play the long game because they are united. So it really doesn't behoove them to get into a shooting war proper with the United States. They have a completely different form of government that can play the long game compared to our form of government.
But do you think we'd even challenge that? I mean, if China went into Taiwan, do you think that, I mean, we might challenge it on a sanctions level. We might challenge it by maybe supplying weapons to armed groups inside Taiwan. We may help them that way, but would we really get in a fight with China? Do you think? We didn't even want to at the DoD level.
I won't even speculate on that one. I won't speculate on that or give you my personal opinion. But yeah, I mean, a lot of this is just historic agreements. So if you look at Formosa, Taiwan,
right?
When the nationalists lost power, they just moved over to Formosa, and we call it Taiwan. And then the communists were in power in China. Okay, you have all these instances in the from 20th century decisions that were made in the 20th century, so early to post World War II 20th century, whether it's South Korea, and then post Cold War when we tried to figure out a way to get nuclear weapons from the former Soviet states, Ukraine being one of them.
Right.
All these agreements that we made decades and decades to centuries ago, we still deal with. Or whether you want to talk about the situation with Israel, we are still dealing with things that are decades to centuries old. And
we should have had really good lawyers with a lot of foresight back then to put in clauses and loopholes. Yes. This will be the clause that will get you out. Yes. This is the loophole. Oh, you didn't read section B. We didn't. Right? Yeah. Because we're kind of stuck with what these treaties and these have come up with. Right. And that is where I agree with you. What about this book, The Unrestricted Warfare? China's Master Plan, to destroy America. That book that came out a while back. Everybody refers to it. I've looked at it. I mean, seems like they got that plan underway. It's kind of like just out there for us. Like, hey, here's the plan we got to destroy you, and you guys don't even care, or you don't seem to.
That's accurate. They haven't been hiding anything that they've been doing militarily or economically. They're just doing it.
Why do we let it happen? Do we just think nothing's going to come of it? Do we just believe, do we just have this, as Americans, this very positive outlook, well, people say those things, but they don't really mean it kind of American attitude about things?
I don't have the highest opinion of post-Cold War politicians and non-elected government leaders. I mean, I believe that a large part of the American government has been asleep at the wheel. And I mentioned that I was a young person in Latin America, where your husband was down there training. Latin America used to be hot in the 80s, 90s.
That's seventh group, right? Seventh group. You were with seventh?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay.
I was in seventh group. So whether we're fighting the communists or whether we're fighting the drug war, what have you, that was a focus. It hasn't been a focus in a very long time. We've abandoned the Monroe Doctrine, and we've allowed, Russia, we've allowed China, we've allowed the IRGC and Iranians to penetrate into Latin America. Latin America is part of the Americas. You can't cede Latin America, if you're in charge here in the United States. No, I think there's been great dereliction close to home in the post-Cold War period.
I absolutely, and this is a great part to veer to, because one of my biggest issues right now that I think we are not paying attention to is the Western Hemisphere. I think it should be the envy of the world. I think we have resources, unimaginable resources. We have allowed nations like Venezuela, Cuba. I mean, and I'm talking, this is long. I'm not blaming all of this on Biden. It goes way back. But we have allowed, like you said, our Western Hemisphere, despite the Monroe Doctrine, to be penetrated by our adversaries with no real fight from us. Not really. And we have put ourselves at risk. We literally have the enemy in a game, but not a game, surrounding us. and infiltrating our territory. What can we do to change that? How do we get our government to take that seriously enough that this becomes a major priority for whatever administration gets elected this year?
They need to
Hopefully, Trump.
They need to establish priorities, and age-old priorities that are based on path dependence don't necessarily need to remain at the top of that list. They need to raise Western Hemisphere to a much higher priority for our foreign policy, in my personal opinion. One area you mentioned in the beginning is Ukraine. When you talk about NATO as an example, I love to put slides up of the European Union and NATO in class and ask students for the difference. And if you look real close, you'll see that it's now 4, it was 3, but it's only Turkey, the United Kingdom, Canada, and the United States that aren't members of the European Union. So in essence, since the end of World War II, and since we signed on to the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, the United States has paid for the security of Europe. That would be fine.
Which is why President Trump was so adamant about,
Absolutely.
Hey, Germany, you better pay your share and everybody else because we're paying for your security.
That would be fine, Sarah, if they were grateful. They are not grateful. I travel a lot to Europe. You can go and if you look in the bookstore, if you want to see a book on Obama or Biden or Hillary Clinton or Michelle Obama, they're translated all over European bookstores. But they are very down on the United States, despite the United States paying for their security and allowing them to, each of those members of the European Union, to establish social welfare states to where they provide free health care. Every time a Democrat brings up free health care and says America should be more like Denmark or use any other example you want of some micro state, I always get angry because American taxpayers have paid for those systems, in my opinion.
That just is, it's so infuriating. You are so right. I am friends with Ambassador Rick Grenell, who was ambassador to Germany under the Trump administration. And I think he's done a phenomenal job. And I think he did a phenomenal job at holding their feet to the fire, I think to the chagrin of the German politicians. But I really, truly understand what you are saying about the Europeans not holding their fair share of the weight. I love fast growing trees and I can't wait for spring because I'm going to be planting again. And guys, this is the best place to buy your plants. There's nothing more exciting than seeing them come to your front door, right? Come to your front door where you could open your boxes and find your beautiful fig trees and lemon trees and lime trees. And I'm just so excited. And I'll be planting them with you on Instagram. Did you know Fast Growing Trees is the biggest online nursery in the US with more than 10,000 different kinds of plants and over 2 million happy customers in the United States? You can grow avocado, olive, or fig trees inside your home on top of the wide variety of houseplants available. Fast Growing Trees makes it easy to order online, and your plants are shipped directly to your door in 1 to 2 days. And along with their 30-day Alive and Thrive guarantee, they offer free plant consultation forever. And I can tell you this, I absolutely love them. I love my banana trees. I love my lemons. I love my limes. I love my avocados and my fig trees. And I'm so excited. And I get tons of lemon off my lemon trees. It's so exciting. I can't wait to share that all with you. Right now, they have the best deals online, up to half off on select plants. Plus, when you use code Carter, CARTER at checkout, you save an additional 15%. Go to fastgrowingtrees.com. Be sure to use code Carter, CARTER at checkout for an additional 15% off. Fastgrowingtrees.com, code CARTER. Offer is valid for a limited time. Tell them we sent you. What do you think happens with when we're talking about Ukraine, though? There's an enormous frustration among some Americans. It's obviously very divided. I talk to people that say, look, we need to keep pushing against Vladimir Putin because this is the only way. We've got to proxy war him here because this guy is just, he's expanding his power. He's not afraid. I have others who say, look, this is just saber rattling, and Putin felt like he could get away with this right now, but he really can't continue to afford this. There's a way to negotiate ourselves out of this mess, or the Ukraine and Russia out of the mess for the benefit of the whole world. What do you think happens here? I mean, do you have any ideas or any advice that you think people should probably take as they're, based on your knowledge of history? How do we navigate this before it becomes a much bigger problem, a much bigger war?
Number one, when President Trump's reelected, that's going to be high on his plate to deal with. So I'm not worried about the Ukraine in that manner. I do worry about where we've come today in how we've responded with different aid to Ukraine. You do not say that you're going to write a blank check to a country to do whatever they will. And when it's been
no accountability, Dr. Vogt.
It's a corrupt country. And even in the legislation that's written right now that they're debating, you don't pay benefits, retirement benefits, and disability benefits for another country. Everything we give Ukraine is on credit. We operate annually at a deficit of nearly $1 trillion. And then everything beyond that, we add to our annual deficits, which compounds in our national debt. So everything we give them should be examined. Can we really afford to give that to them? Now, they've done it from their soapboxes, whether you want to call it NATO or European Union, United States, what have you, just out there talking about nonstop. Whereas there are other models. For instance, when the Soviets went into Afghanistan, that was a different model that the United States used. But to blindly stand behind that country and tell them that they have a blank check, I disagree with. Now,
and we're looking at their military force, and we know that a good portion of their young, able-bodied, military-age men are not there right now. I mean, they've had to recruit from their older populations, which is fine. I'm sure they've got great fighters. There's some, people there that are willing to fight the fight, but they're dipping into, smaller and smaller fighting forces. They're going to need our resources. They're going to need our money, is what they say, to continue this fight. And it's very frustrating when the American people, look, President Trump's right. We're standing here. We're surrounded by an enemy. We've got a border wide open. We have a huge amount of deficit in our nation. Our country is faced with an addiction crisis as well as a fentanyl death crisis. I call it a murder. I've never seen so many people die. Over 112,000, over 60% to fentanyl. Some of them had no idea they were taking a pill that was laced with it. I think that's murder. And so we have a very, very serious crisis in our country.
And we're enablers. So when we get back to those treaties, right after the Cold War, we admitted in exchange for Ukraine giving up its nuclear weapons, them into the Partnership for Peace program to NATO. Okay, fine. But we've enabled them to suspend elections. We've enabled them to pay non-military related expenses. We've enabled them to just continue to do what they want to do without input from us. There is no strategic objective that will end the war in Ukraine currently stated by the Biden administration.
That's incredible.
I moved to your point there on national interest. What's our national interest compared to our national interest at our southern border?
Right. What is it?
The current administration and previous administrations, politicians with our border have been lost. How can that be such a low priority? When we talked about priority list before, how can our southern border be such a low priority on our list?
Unless the priority was to keep it wide open, a policy that allowed it to be wide open, and that of course then changes the trajectory of priorities, doesn't it?
But that's also short-sighted policy. They always bring up that. Okay, I saw an article today that said. We've let so many people across the border in the Biden administration's time, that they can, once they start to vote, they could elect 22 representatives to the House. That's very short-sighted. When you start to look at all the criminals that come across, the fentanyl that comes across, these aren't just God-fearing families looking for a better life that are coming across the border. We have no idea who's coming across the border.
Which is exactly why I was actually speaking to someone today, an intelligence, retired intelligence person from the United States, who said to me that, they started to see that type of weaponization of, and I'm talking about foreign leaders weaponizing the migration patterns and movements into the United States going back at least 2-3 decades, and watching them push these criminals. I think we could go all the way back to Cuba, to the Mariel, when they unloaded those boats in Florida. And, I'm Cuban. I'm half Cuban. I'll tell you right now, every single Cuban that came with my mom on the Johnson Freedom flights was like, those people that are getting dumped off, we don't even know who they are. Some of them are coming from prison. Some of them have, moved narcotics. These are not doctors or lawyers or, the best of the best. This is the worst of the worst. Not all of them, but a lot of them. And we've seen Russia do it with migration patterns from Russia. We've seen Venezuela do it. And again, living blindly. And I think we talked about that. Our government is not obviously paying attention to this, or they don't care. Last couple of questions. This one I wanted to get from you really quick. How do you analyze President Putin's interview with Tucker? If you got a chance to see it. If you didn't, don't even worry about it. I won't even keep.
I saw snippets and I read articles on it.
Did you? What was your impression? Like, what was your impression of Vladimir Putin? Not so much Tucker. I know Tucker. I've known Tucker since I was a very young reporter, and I was on one of his shows. I think it was the very first time I was on television was with Tucker when he was at NBC. So I love Tucker. But Vladimir Putin was very interesting to me. It was as if, and you're an intel guy, he kept throwing out these like dossier things at Tucker, like, remember when you wanted to join the CIA? Yeah. And then he would do something else. It was kind of like, very type A, manly man, stare down, but yet and then he talked forever about the history of Ukraine, which I thought was fascinating. Like, he was just like, I'm just going to keep talking about this and drive Tucker crazy. Did you see like tactics being used? Any assessment did you take away anything from it?
Well, number one, I'm happy Tucker did it.
Me too.
You're a journalist, so I won't talk bad about journalists. But in the modern era,
I'm now a columnist. Let's not. No, I'm just. Now I'm fully open.
In the infotainment era, it's very hard to get information.
Right.
And they will talk about, he never should have done it. He gave him free publicity, so on and so forth. We need journalists to provide information. And that has not been the case. So in Ukraine, it's very hard to get information, what's going on in Ukraine. You can watch Euronews or what have you, and they'll just put a map up and they'll talk about, okay, this is what happened here, but tactical situation stuff. It's hard to get information from Ukraine and Russia, what's going on right now. But Putin is old school KGB. So when you watch that interview, he was very well prepared.
Yes.
Very well prepared. He had his points that he was going to get in. Whether or not he was going to let Tucker know that he'd done his research on him, or what he wanted to put out to the world in the format that he wanted to put it out. You don't stay in power in Russia for as long as he has without being an incredibly smart person.
Absolutely. I always say it. It's like the warlords in Afghanistan. If you aren't willing to fight like to the death and then teach a lesson, I guess you could teach lessons to people that other people will never want to challenge you. I'm not going to say what some of those warlords have done so that people won't challenge them, but you just won't remain in power. You'll just lose everything or you'll be dead. Last but not least, your book is amazing. Where can our listeners and our viewers get the book? And we would love to have you back on the show.
Oh, I'd be happy to come back. Ghosts of Samara, you can get it at Amazon.com. You can put in Ghosts of Samara. You can put in my name, Tobias Vogt. It's going to be hard to spell Samara. It's going to be hard to spell Vogt, but I mean, you'll get there in the end. It was for a time when it was first released, it was number one in a very small niche of Iraq war history. So it was a bestseller at that point. But Amazon.com, it will come up either by name or by title.
Yeah, don't forget that, guys. Ghosts of Samara. And for the spelling of Samara, it's Samarra, Samara. And it's Dr. Vogt, 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 German spelling. I did pronounce it a little bit more Germany in the beginning, but a little bit more German accent right there. But it's Dr. Vogt, Vogt. Thank you so much, Dr. Vogt, for being on the Sara Carter Show. You're amazing. I loved your analysis. Thank you very much. I can't wait to get you back on.
Thanks for having me, Sarah.
Thank you so much, Dr. Vogt. I can't wait to have you back on the show. Please make sure you're subscribed to the Sara Carter Show on your favorite podcast app. It helps us keep the show free and really gives us a boost in the algorithm. If you are watching on Rumble or YouTube, give us a like and a follow as well. Thank you so much. Again, follow me on Truth at Sara Carter Official, on X at Sara Carter DC, and on Instagram at SCarterDC. God bless you. God bless President Trump, because he's going to need all the blessings he can get this year as we make our way to November 2024. God bless our great nation, and God bless the great state of Texas.